Hello, welcome to Through Veterans' Eyes, Liberators of Dachau and Buchenwald concentration camps. In this presentation, you'll hear eyewitness, never-heard-before stories of American GIs who liberated Nazi concentration camps during World War II. These stories are from the pages of my book, Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, which is available at the links shown. During the 1990s, while working as a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, I was able to take my young family to visit many of the historic sites associated with World War II. We visited the Remagen Bridge, the D-Day beaches of Normandy, the Ardennes Forest where the Battle of the Bulge was fought, the house of the Wannsee Conference where the planning of the final solution occurred, the topography of terror, the SS former headquarters, and the German Resistance Memorial, where Colonel von Stauffenberg made his assassination attempt of Adolf Hitler, and finally the concentration camps of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz. There at Auschwitz, seeing gymnasium-sized room after gymnasium-sized room filled with human hair, suitcases, artificial limbs, eyeglasses, and most terrifying, stuffed animals that you knew were ripped from the hands of children who were sent straight to the gas chambers upon arrival. The enormity of a World War II and what was at stake was driven home to me. I remember I sat in the corner and I cried, and I began writing to World War II veterans to thank them for the sacrifices they made for my freedom and to create a world that was worth living in. And I invited them to share their stories with me, promising to keep them alive in the classes I taught and in the pages of this book. I'm Dr. John Alfertz, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. White nationalism is on the rise in 2020. It's hard to believe that the United States has more neo-Nazis than anywhere else in the world, but it does. Time magazine in August of 2019 wrote, "Since 9/11, white supremacists and other far-right extremists have been responsible for almost 3 times as many attacks on U.S. soil as Islamic terrorists," the government reported. From 2009 through 2018, the far right has been responsible for 73% of domestic extremist-related fatalities, according to a 2019 study by the Anti-Defamation League. White nationalism isn't the only thing on the rise in 2020, so are Holocaust deniers. Sadly, the Anti-Defamation League found that only 54% of the world's population has heard of the Holocaust, and only 1/3 of the world's population believes the genocide has been accurately described in historical accounts. Many think the number of people who died has been exaggerated. Others said they believe it's a myth. What better way to dispel Holocaust deniers than to listen to the stories of American veterans, U.S. GIs, who liberated these camps. The Nazis created over 100 concentration camps throughout Europe. Jews were herded onto boxcars and sent to these camps. Concentration camps primarily consisted of 2 kinds, slave labor camps and death camps. Larger camps like Dachau and Buchenwald had many smaller satellite camps around them. By 1942, assembly line murder of Jews and death camps had begun in Eastern Europe. Throughout 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers produced 4,000 to 5,000 corpses per an hour. 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust, and the Jews are rightly remembered as the group that Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party most savagely persecuted. In this slide, you'll see in black the total number of Jews from each European country that were killed. In red is the percentage of the Jewish population in that country that died in World War II. As you can see, some countries did a much better job of protecting their Jewish populations than others. Denmark, for example, only lost 1% of its Jewish population, as did Finland. Other countries, such as Lithuania and Estonia, lost much higher percentages, 93% and 99%. Hitler knew that he would find sympathy in Eastern Europe with its history of anti-Semitism to his extermination camps, and that was one reason why he located them there. The Nazis didn't just target Jews, though, in their camps. There were many other groups as well, targeted for their race and their beliefs. Historians estimate the total number of deaths to be 11 million, 6 million Jewish people, 5 million victims encompassing gay people, priests, gypsies, people with mental and physical disabilities, communists, trade unionists, Jehovah's Witnesses, anarchists, Poles, and other Slavic peoples, as well as resistance fighters. Almost from the very beginning that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he preached anti-Semitism, which has existed in Europe throughout centuries. As soon as he gained power, he began opening concentration camps. Ghettos were also used to concentrate the Jewish population for deportation. 36 camps grew up around Dachau, and 37,000 prisoners worked in armament production. Dachau and Buchenwald both primarily supported armament production for the Nazi war effort. 136 satellite camps grew up around Buchenwald, which eventually housed 250,000 prisoners. The cheap labor that prisoners could provide was ruthlessly exploited. Prisoners worked 7 days a week, 11 hours a day, in stone quarries. During the war, Dachau and Buchenwald prisoners were treated like guinea pigs for medical experiments. At Dachau, 1,100 prisoners were infected with malaria. Others were infected with tuberculosis. Prisoners were also put in decompression chambers to simulate conditions pilots were exposed to at great heights. Freezing and drowning experiments were also held. At concentration camps like Buchenwald, diabolical experiments were performed on innocent concentration camp prisoners. Ohrdruf was a slave labor camp near Ohrdruf in Thuringia, Germany. A satellite camp of Buchenwald, Ohrdruf was the first concentration camp liberated by the American GIs on April 4, 1945. Slave labor was used to dig tunnels in nearby mountains for a planned railroad line that would connect to a communications center in the basement of the Mühlberg Castle. The tunnels would provide an emergency shelter for a train that was to contain the Fuhrhauptquartier, a secret hideout for Adolf Hitler. The project was never completed due to the Allied advance. An armament factory was also located there, and it is thought that the Nazis intended to house their nuclear bomb project in the tunnels as well. By 1945, 20,000 prisoners were held at Ohrdruf. As the Americans approached, many concentration camp prisoners were forced on a death march to Buchenwald. Those too sick to go were shot at Ohrdruf or along the march. The dead bodies piled at the camp led General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, to visit the camp on April 12th, along with Generals George S. Patton and Omar Bradley. Mark D. Wilson of Clarksburg, West Virginia, was with the 80th Division in Erfurt, Germany, when it liberated Ohrdruf concentration camp. In the picture to the right, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and other high-ranking U.S. Army officers view the bodies of prisoners who were killed there. Wilson remembered the liberation. General Patton sent down orders to send personnel to view the camp and see what we were fighting for and against, the savage inhumanity of the Nazis. I was selected to go from our company, and I saw this firsthand. There were bodies stacked up and sprinkled with lime, piles of burned bodies. Some appeared to have been burned alive, a crematorium, and a few living, walking around slowly and in a daze. They looked like walking skeletons. The army had commandeered German civilians from Erfurt to dig graves. Buchenwald concentration camp was liberated almost by accident on April 11, 1945, by a patrol led by Captain Frederick Keffer of the 9th Armored Infantry Battalion. Keffer's patrol was in a little village outside of Weimar when they came across 3 or 4 Russians who were fighting 2 or 3 Germans with fists and knives. The Russians had tracked down the Germans, who had imprisoned them in a nearby concentration camp. The Russians reported that thousands of prisoners were still located in the camp, too sick or weak to escape, just 10 to 15 miles from where they were. After clearing it with his commander, Captain Keffer loaded the Russians into his scout car and had them direct him to the camp. Upon arrival, Captain Keffer found thousands of emaciated prisoners in desperate need of medical attention. They were joyously greeted and raised onto the shoulders of the prisoners. How the men found such a surge of strength in their emaciated condition was one of those bodily wonders in which the spirit overcomes all weakness of the flesh, Captain Keffer recalled. James S. Moncrief of Charlotte, North Carolina. The welfare of prisoners was the responsibility of James S. Moncrief, who served as General Robert W. Grove's personnel officer. Moncrief went to the camp himself a few hours after Keffer to assess the situation. In a June 13, 1996 letter, Moncrief described his actions at Buchenwald. My message to Boggs was that the situation was far worse than we had imagined. When I got back to division headquarters, he and I spent the better part of the rest of the night reporting to the Army, answering their questions. As a result of the info we gave to the Army, Patton's headquarters was able on the very next day to start the relief effort and sent all of the required troops, medical engineers, and others required for the job. 20,000 prisoners were freed at the camp. Robert Muhler of Lima, Ohio. I recall going to the prison gate with several friends, and 2 prisoners came up from inside, and they offered to take us for a brief tour. Both spoke English. They took us first to the crematorium, and as we walked towards that building, we passed piles of bodies stacked like cordwood, waiting to be burned. Their naked bodies had swollen bellies and arms and legs like sticks. We were taken down to the crematorium, and one prisoner pointed out a wooden chute, like a coal chute, leading down to the basement. He explained that the SS didn't waste bullets. If they wanted to get rid of a prisoner, they forced him to bend down with his head over the chute. He was hit over the head, crushing his skull, and flung down the chute, where his skull was further crushed by other SS guards. We were all shocked. We went down to the basement and saw where the bodies arrived after being thrown down the chute. A prisoner pointed out the meat hooks on the wall where the bodies were hung until they stiffened. I vividly recall the prisoner explaining how the SS guards tried to wash the blood away, knowing that we were coming, but the stains were very obvious. The furnace was in the basement where the bodies were cremated. Our unit stayed at Buchenwald about 1 week, restoring order and standing guard, keeping the prisoners from wandering off. But they were so weak they had trouble walking, merely milling about, gazing at us with surprise and curiosity. During his time at Buchenwald, Muhler found himself drawn to those skeleton men walking around, and yet repelled. I had never seen such emaciated people. In this picture, the second bunk from the bottom, in the middle bunk you'll see 4 men. On the far right, closest to the pillar, is the author, Elie Wiesel. Muhler's experiences in the war led him to become a Presbyterian minister, explaining, "By choice, I am now a pacifist. We don't stop killing by more killing, and I trust in a greater power to lead us all into being peacemakers, who shall be called sons of God. Love sets us free." John M. Williams, Honolulu, Hawaii. After the war, while attending Texas Christian University in 1946, Williams wrote about what he found at Buchenwald in an essay he called Concentration Camp Chaos. To see a dead man is not horrible. However, an unbelievably ghastly reality is to see dead men walking as in this prison where starvation was a favorite method of killing. An English-speaking German Jew, Mr. Bernstein, was an inmate of this institution. Mr. Bernstein met Williams at the gate of the prison and voluntarily offered his services as a guide. Bernstein had been a chemist in civilian life, and therefore he was assigned to the Buchenwald Hospital Laboratory, where inmates were inoculated with toxin and disease. Once the prisoners contracted diseases, they were used to furnish serum for frontline German soldiers. Bernstein assisted with this work, which was supervised by Nazi stormtroopers. Bernstein told Williams that his knowledge of chemistry saved his life, inasmuch as he treated some of the dead bodies, making them non-poisonous. After treating the dead bodies, Bernstein confided that he ate some of them to keep from starving. "Upon my honor, I do not believe he lied," Williams said, "as no man would have reason to tell such a lie." We were escorted to the sick wards of the camp, where all prisoners beyond the working stage were taken. Buchenwald was a combination labor-starvation camp. All prisoners were field and factory laborers until they collapsed from lack of food. The prisoners were then taken to the sick wards to die. These wards were one-room barn-like buildings, approximately one-half the size of the Texas Christian University Gymnasium. Each ward held 2,000 to 3,000 dying men. These men were lying on the floor and in pigeon-holed shelves built into the walls. There was no bedding, heat, medicine, or any sort of attention. Several times daily the death wagon was brought around to the wards to collect the dead, just as if they were garbage. Bodies were thrown onto the cart as if they were sacks of potatoes. Next, Bernstein took us to the crematorium, where the bodies of the dead were destroyed. They were destroyed by coal fire in the camp, provided that there were no orders from the Denmark soap factories for the dead. Many trainloads of dead were shipped to the Nazi soap factories in Denmark and made into that ever-scarce item. The other notable methods of death at Buchenwald were the gassing method, shooting, and the nail method. The latter method was a unique device for killing the condemned. Prisoners were lined up next to a wall according to their heights. The executioner pushed a lever, and out of the wall shot a nail-like object into the head of each of the victims. The lever was then drawn back, and the death house was again ready for more condemned men. These systems were used when the camp became overcrowded and starvation was too slow. The commandant of Buchenwald was wed to a creature whose hobby was collecting tattoos. Her name was Ilse Koch. At intervals, the woman would wander through the camp searching for interesting tattoos on the chests and arms of the shirtless prisoners. If a tattoo appealed to Mrs. Horror, she would order the bearer of the tattoo to be shot. We saw many of the book covers, lampshades, pocketbooks, and bags made from this human tattooed skin. Art Zander of Rockford, Illinois. Art Zander was one of an unlucky 870 American soldiers who were prisoned in Nazi concentration camps instead of prisoner war camps. Zander found himself an inmate of Buchenwald after the B-24 bomber he navigated was shot down over France 4 days after D-Day. After 7 weeks of hiding, he was double-crossed by a Frenchman he thought was with the resistance, and he was turned over to the Gestapo. The Gestapo herded them into railway cars to begin their journey to Buchenwald. 60 of us were in cattle cars. There was no room to sit or lie down. We had to stand up for 5 days with no food or water. That was rough, really rough. On approximately August 30th, 1944, the airmen arrived at Buchenwald. As soon as they entered the camp, the airmen had their hair cut off. Then they were sent to the showers, which the airmen suspected had a more insidious use than bathing. They took us in the shower room, and there were dual vents. We recognized what it was right away. One was for water, and one was for gas. We thought, this is it, but they turned the water on. The airmen never were given concentration camp uniforms, but were instead given clothes taken from dead prisoners. Shoes were not included, at least not at first, nor were the airmen assigned to a bunkhouse. Instead, they were instructed to stay and sleep on a rock slab, the cement foundation of a bunkhouse. On his third day at Buchenwald, Zander saw B-17s flying towards the camp. He could see that the B-17s were dropping smoke bombs, indicating the target for the bombers. The factory outside Buchenwald which had made component parts for German V1s and machine guns with slave labor from the camp, was hit hard. The factory was soon ablaze. Angry guards commanded Zander and the other airmen to put out the fire. "You started that fire, now put it out," Zander recalled the command. The airmen struggled to put out the fire, their bare feet burning since they had not yet been issued shoes. Zander recalled the gas chambers were working all the time. I could tell when they were burning bodies by the smell and the black smoke. The prisoners were always concerned about whose name was going to appear next on the list for the crematorium. Escape was nearly impossible, though some prisoners still tried. The penalty, when they were inevitably caught, was death. 3 guys attempted to escape and they were caught. They made the whole camp assemble to see them get hanged. Ilse Koch, the Witch of Buchenwald, was also seen frequently walking around the camp. If she liked the tattoos a guy had, she had him killed and skinned, and she made a nightshade for herself, Zander recalled. After the war, Koch was tried for war crimes by the U.S. military court and sentenced to life imprisonment for instigation of murder and cruelty to Buchenwald's inmates. In 1967, at the age of 60, Koch hung herself in her prison cell at the Bavarian Women's Prison in Dachau, Germany. On March 20th, 1933, Heinrich Himmler announced the establishment of Dachau concentration camp, less than 2 months after Hitler had seized power. The SS took control of the camp a month later, and the prisoners lost all of their civil rights. Dachau began as a camp for political prisoners, but communists, monarchists, social democrats, religious prisoners such as Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, and Jews were also imprisoned there. After Kristallnacht of November 1938, 10,000 Jews were brought to Dachau. By the winter of 1944, 1,600 people were crowded into barracks intended for 200 at Dachau. Heinrich Himmler issued an order to the commanders of Dachau and Flossenburg on April 14, 1945. Not a single living prisoner must fall into the hands of the enemy. 2 prisoners from Dachau escaped on April 26, 1945, and found American troops. They asked the Americans to come to Dachau as quick as possible. The Americans had intended to capture Munich, but changed their plans to arrive first in Dachau. Also on that day, the SS began marching 7,000 prisoners out of the camp, shooting hundreds of them when they tired. American troops overtook the columns and liberated the camp on April 29, 1945. Barney, Zylka, Duluth, Minnesota. We had a tank knock down the iron fence at Dachau, and we went in with our rifles ready, because there were krauts dressed like prisoners taking shots at us. I never saw any snipers, but as I was looking at the thousands of 60-pound skeletons lying on their bunks piled over each other 6 or 7 layers high, I was wishing and crying at the same time that I would see a kraut so I could empty my rifle into his belly. When me and a sergeant broke into Dachau, the ovens were still burning, and heads and feet were sticking out of them. I cried like a little kid. I even threw up there. Even dead soldiers didn't bother me, but those concentration camps, I'll never forget them. Barney was one of the veterans that I visited, as was Jim Dorris, who you'll soon hear from, and Art Zander. But Barney Zylka said, "Don't let your family or anyone forget all these atrocities. Teach them, tell them what I told you here. I hate when people say this never happened. Believe me, it did. It was real." When the American soldiers saw the pathetic condition of Dachau's prisoners and the bodies stacked around the camp like firewood, they reacted with anger directed against the concentration guards. Mann recalled, "On the day the camp was liberated, angry American soldiers from our battalion lined up dozens against a wall, and for a few seconds we mowed them down with a machine gun or a bar until the battalion commander stopped them." As American troops approached Buchenwald on April 7, 1945, the SS put 4,480 prisoners, mostly the able-bodied so they could work, on a sealed prisoner train to Flossenburg, a concentration camp in the German state of Bavaria. All of the wagons arrived in Dachau on April 27th. 2 days later, the Americans would liberate Dachau. They found a death train of 1,500 corpses on 45 cars. Jim Dorris of Chattanooga, Tennessee. As he approached Dachau, Dorris passed a train that was stopped on the track about 500 meters from the camp itself. Upon arrival at the camp, we saw a train of 40 boxcars loaded with bodies of prisoners who had been sent from other camps to Dachau. I'll never forget the sight of the bodies lying on top of each other and spilled out onto the ground when guards had opened the doors to machine gun anyone who was still alive. Most of them had died from starvation on the long trip without food and water. Later, some of our men searching the cars had found one man still alive. The one man that Dorris remembered was Gleb Rohr, a 22-year-old Russian anti-communist who was rescued. He went on to become a journalist for Radio Free Europe and spent the rest of his life in Munich, Germany. Jim Dorris was a deeply religious Catholic, and the sights and sounds that he saw at Dachau were deeply disturbing. He said, "The whole scene was so totally horrible and depressing, I could only think this must be what hell is like. I started praying and asking God to please get me out of here." Dorris was ordered to stand guard and to keep the inmates in the camp so that they could be examined and treated by American doctors who would arrive later. My post was between the high outside concrete wall with its guard towers and an inside wire fence which had been previously electrified. I had to walk around the body of a man who had been so savagely beaten that his left eye laid out on his cheek. Shortly after Dorris's prayer, a concentration camp prisoner walked to the fence where Dorris was standing guard and asked him for a cigarette. I had 2 or 3 packs, but not enough for all the people who were watching. Fearing to start a riot if I didn't give each of them a cigarette, I told him no. He asked me to wait, and he ran off behind the barracks. I waited a while, and then he started walking my post again. In a few minutes, he returned, and he handed me a small rusty can through the fence. Inside the can was a small cigarette butt about an inch long. He then said, "This is in thanks for liberating us." Realizing that this was probably the greatest treasure this man owned, I almost cried. Years later, in thinking about this, I felt that this had been God's answer to my prayer to show me His goodness can be found even there. Jim Dorris was a remarkable man whose convictions guided him throughout the war. After Dachau, he decided he had enough of brutality and wasn't going to allow it, no matter whose side committed it. While on patrol in Munich, a few days later after Dachau, Dorris heard a woman screaming from the second floor of a nearby building. With Dachau still fresh on his mind, Dorris knew he had to act. As the screams got louder, he ran up the office building steps 2 at a time. The screams were coming from an old woman who appeared to be in her 70s, who stood in the doorway of what appeared to be the dentist's waiting office. I ran through the door and to my right saw a large glass case filled with dental instruments. To my surprise, I saw one of my platoon buddies smash the glass case with his rifle, spraying shards across the room. Behind the dentist's chair, Dorris spotted 2 of his platoon buddies striking the old dentist with their rifles as he cowered helplessly in the corner. They yelled at him as they hit him. I couldn't believe this was happening, having seen what German guards had done in Dachau just the day before, Dorris explained. Dorris was only a private first class, and his buddies were sergeants, but Dorris knew he had to stop the senseless violence. I shouted as angrily and as loudly as I could, "Stop it, or I'll shoot the next one who hits that old man." The room grew immediately quiet. The sergeants angrily turned towards Dorris. measuring him up, determining whether he would really shoot to protect the old man. Finally, the attention was broken as Sergeant Irvin said, "Let's go, men." Dorris said a silent prayer, thanking God that his bluff had worked. The old dentist and his wife hugged each other as the sergeants exited the office and went down the stairs. The old German couple looked at Dorris with love and affection. Dorris kissed the old woman and left the office. The next day, Dorris asked one of the men why the sergeants had beaten the old dentist. He said Sergeant Irwin thought the dentist filled teeth with gold, and he wanted the supply the office must hold. Dorris could always be counted on to do the right thing. Edmund S. Weiss of Gaithersburg, Maryland, had a particularly grim task. One of my duties was getting bodies to the crematorium before Army Graves registration people took over. Sadly, the dead kept increasing in numbers, especially in the weeks immediately following Dachau's liberation. Unfortunately, deaths at the rate of 20 to 30 men per day occurred during the first few weeks I was there. By the late summer, they were down to 1 or 2 per day. Dachau's liberated inmates were still restricted to the camp to avoid spread of typhus, and they organized themselves into national or ethnic groups. One of these groups was Polish Jews, perhaps a few hundred. The SS turned victim against victim as they recruited capels, prisoners who were assigned by the SS guards to supervise forced labor or carry out administrative tasks. These capels were spared physical abuse and hard labor and given privileges such as civilian clothes and better food for carrying out the SS's orders. If they didn't follow them, they would be returned to becoming ordinary prisoners themselves. Capels were often hated by other concentration camp inmates. Edmund Weiss recalled looking at some of the well-fed, well-dressed survivors a bit differently after having been at Dachau for several weeks, and wondering how they had survived while so many others had perished, and concluded that they must have done some terrible things in order to survive, but none of us know how we would have acted when the choice was to follow orders or die. So I learned not to judge and not to ask too many questions. D. Eberhardt of Ellensburg, Washington, recalled that when the American GIs liberated Dachau, an estimated 32,000 prisoners were found still alive inside the camp. Eberhardt remembered the chaotic days that followed Dachau's liberation as the Army struggled to care for them. Lieutenant Colonel Mickey Flins was placed in charge. He established liaison with the International Committee. They agreed to keep the prisoners confined so that they could be helped and typhus checked. The SS commissary supplied food at first, and an expanded hospital was manned by a medical unit, which soon arrived. Unfortunately, individual soldiers tried to help by giving the victims K and C rations. In some cases, this caused deaths because they had been deprived of solid food for too long. D. Eberhardt of Ellensburg, Washington. As they did at Buchenwald, liberated only weeks before, the Allied Army Command forced local German civilians to tour the camp. General Eisenhower wanted to establish as many witnesses as possible. Thus the stacked bodies were left exposed, Eberhardt wrote. Eberhardt believed the local German civilians were well aware of what had been going on at Dachau even before they visited the camp. Eberhardt had spent the night in an old woman's house near the camp. He said, "She denied all knowledge of the camp, but I did not believe her. For example, in the house next door, there was a tattooed human skin lampshade, but the people who lived there, civilian or SS, were gone." David Israel of Medford, Oregon, was not at Dachau for its liberation on April 29, 1945, but arrived shortly thereafter with a 5-man intelligence team. Despite having spent nearly a year in what he called a godforsaken place, when Israel returned to Dachau for the 50th anniversary of its liberation, he was amazed to find that I remembered absolutely nothing. My mind had been purged of all memory. Israel could not even identify the streets around the compound, nor the one that he lived on, less than a mile away from Dachau. When the Americans arrived at the main camp of Dachau, they found approximately 32,000 prisoners, still alive, but only barely. Israel recalled, "They died at the rate of 200 to 400 per a day after being liberated because of starvation and disease." Amongst Dachau's survivors was one American OSS officer, Lieutenant Rene Girard of Cicero, Illinois. Most of the townspeople claimed total ignorance about Dachau's true purpose. Israel rejected this as an impossibility for several reasons. Many of them worked in the camp, and the prisoners worked in many of the town industries and were marched through the town on a daily basis. And since the trains rolled through the town daily with their human cargo, not to mention that the guards drank in the town bars and boasted about their heroic work in the camp. The SS conducted many businesses in the camp and sold their goods to townspeople in Dachau and Munich. As for the hundreds of dead bodies found at Dachau, including those who perished in the 39-car abandoned death train near the camp, the townspeople were forced by the Americans to dig them mass graves. They buried the death train's unfortunate passengers on a hill alongside an Italian monument just outside of town. In an ironic twist of fate, after the war some 15,000 SS officers were imprisoned at Dachau, the very same camp where they had tortured so many innocent civilians. Israel was assigned to a 5-man intelligence team whose mission was to interrogate the SS officers at the camp. Even 50 years later, Israel didn't want to talk much about his interrogation of the SS, but he did admit in an interview in the Davis Enterprise newspaper that he harbored brutal thoughts towards them. Israel said, "While many Nazi guards were killed during the liberation of Dachau, either by American soldiers or by the prisoners themselves, 40 were captured, and they were put on trial prior to the Nuremberg war trials. 36 were sentenced to death. Most of the SS who were interred at Dachau were later released." And the picture on the left is one of those trials taking place at Dachau. On the right is David Israel at the age of 19. In a June 4, 1997 letter, Israel recalled that a neighbor had recently asked him, "When are you people going to forget about the Holocaust?" after a showing of Schindler's List on television. Israel wrote, "I slowly took another sip of coffee before answering. Then I changed the subject. For 4 months I have agonized over how I was going to answer the son of a bitch, since I wanted my answer to be quite clear and unmistakable. Having come from Brooklyn, New York, 70 years ago, and having been around the block several times, I knew immediately with which type of denier I was dealing with. At this age one does not respond with a pop on the snoot, but I wanted my answer to hit the bastard a shot that he would remember for a long time. Your letter gave me the answer I was looking for, and on the 28th of this month, when I am scheduled to deliver a speech to the retirement community where we live, I will give my answer in public, thanks to you." The Nazis used 22 main concentration camps, along with an estimated 1,200 auxiliary camps, to murder the 15 to 20 million people who perished in the Holocaust. Alex Burdas of Kinston, North Carolina, recalled liberating an auxiliary camp of Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. The auxiliary camp had been housed in what had once been an aluminum factory. As we approached the factory, we began to pick up the stench of something very unpleasant, which was assumed to be the smell of decaying bodies. We found the evidence in the yard beside the factory. There were piles of dead POWs placed crossways on carts and covered with lime to cut down on the odor until they could be buried. There could easily have been 100 bodies on each of these carts. There was no way you could possibly recognize anyone. It was learned that 20,000 POWs had been held there. There was a mixed bag of POWs. Some were Americans, some British, French, you name it. There was just a lot of mixed aliens who couldn't understand one another, only the English speaking. Alex Burdos recalled, "Most of the camp guards had switched clothing and took off. However, we did find a few. The POWs helped with this chore. Some of the POWs wanted to use our weapons and to go after the guards who had escaped. They would recognize them in or out of uniform, but we couldn't let them have our rifles for a number of reasons." The name of the concentration camp he liberated may have escaped Tom Carr of Merrick, New York, but the nightmarish memory of it never could. "I was the first American to enter a small concentration camp. I don't remember where, closed in by a tall stockade fence. Emaciated people in cells and logs piled crisscross with bodies on top, and 5-gallon terry cans of gasoline at the ready for the burning. Fortunately, the German captors had left hurriedly before we got there. When asked the nearby residents how they were not able to smell the awful stench, they said they thought it was some kind of soap factory." Near Marienbad, Czechoslovakia, Charles Savage of East Smithfield, Pennsylvania, was assigned to a small concentration camp that had just been liberated, named Flaschenhütten, near the small village of Skler. Savage was shocked by the mass grave he found there. During the 1990s, Savage returned to the Czech Republic numerous times, each time with the hope of finding the then-forgotten concentration camp. During one trip in 1997, Savage accompanied a local Czech historian who thought he had found the location of the camp. The historian was soon disappointed. Savage recalled, "The minute I walked through the area, I knew that this was not the place. He was very upset when I told him he was wrong, that this was not the place. For 2 days he fumed and was quite distressed. I even drew him a map of the camp from my memory, locating all the buildings, the gates, the roads, the towers, minefields, and I even drew the compass directions, north, east, south, west. He was impressed, but he was not convinced." On the last day of Charles Savage's visit with the historian, as they started their drive back to Pilsen, they drove through an area they had not been before. Suddenly Savage got an eerie feeling, and he insisted the historian stop the car. Savage wrote, "I got out, and I walked to an open field with a few trees, and there it was. I was able to show him where the main gate had been, the minefield across from the gate, the towers. We found the foundations of all the buildings. I showed him where the mass grave had been, and we could see a slight depression in that area. Both of us were overwhelmed. I was so emotionally spent that I cried." Savage's last mission, one of remembrance and commemoration, had finally been completed. The International Dachau Committee honored the 7th Army Liberators, called the Rainbow Division, with a plaque erected on the old Dachau main gate with its Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, inscription. For the ceremony on December 1st, 1996, D. Eberhardt wrote the poem Dachau Waits. Dachau waits. Dachau, restless and uneasy, waits. One day past freedom, snow softly fell, but could not hide the horror there. The chill remains, throughout all seasons, felt by those who live within the shadow, who wish that it would go away. Survivors still return on pilgrimage. When they are gone, who then will keep the memory? Who then will keep eternal vigil? Dachau, restless and uneasy, waits. Dachau haunted D. Eberhardt the rest of his life. He was a deeply philosophical man and he realized Dachau taught him the failings of humanity. He wrote, "Only a thin veneer of civilization, probably not original, covers the seething hatreds and potential for brutality beneath. As we know from the events of this century alone, it doesn't take much to lose the demons. I have long since given up on the perfectibility of mankind. Because of the danger of the abyss opening, it seems to me that all of us need to be on guard against hatred and vilification of others. Do good deeds, and especially do what you're doing. Teach true history and important values to the young." Long before I began this project of writing to World War II veterans to thank them for their sacrifices, I had corresponded with Simon Wiesenthal. I was just a boy. It was 1982. Wiesenthal lost 90 of his own family members in the Holocaust, and he himself survived Auschwitz. Wiesenthal was credited with catching hundreds of Nazi war criminals, including Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the masterminds behind the Holocaust. In a letter from 1982, Wiesenthal wrote me, "As long as young people like yourself are aware of the horrors of Nazism and are determined to fight against it, I feel my work is achieving its purpose." Wiesenthal also wrote a book called The Sunflower, in which he imagined a concentration camp inmate approached by a dying Nazi guard who asks the inmate for forgiveness. And Wiesenthal writes the haunting question, "Would you be able to forgive them?" Honestly, I don't think I could. How can we forgive genocide? We can't. Genocide is a war against humanity. It's a war against creation. It's a war against God. Every human life has worth. Every human life has incredible potential. As I look into the eyes of these concentration inmates, I am saddened to think that the Holocaust was not the last genocide this world has experienced. Instead, we've seen several more since then, whether we're talking about Cambodia's Pol Pot or Rwanda's genocide in 1994 or Myanmar. We have seen far too many genocides. Genocide occurs whenever we use race baiting, whenever we start to turn people against one another. Eberhardt's right. There is just this thin veneer that keeps us civilized, and we must always appeal to the better angels of our nature. We must teach each other to love. We must see God in one another, Mother Teresa once wrote, and if we did, we would no longer need so many guns and bombs. I thank you for listening to this broadcast. I hope that you'll seek out additional broadcasts based on my book that I'll be putting on YouTube in the future. And I also hope that you'll purchase my book, Always Remember, World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, on Amazon or one of the other sources, so that you can read more of these stories. For as long as we tell their stories and speak their names, the veterans of World War II will live on. It's the least that we can do for the sacrifices they made for our freedom. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.